Hello, and welcome to this very brief history of life on Earth. So we're going to put this history in the context that we've been seeing over and over again in class, this sort of 24-hour clock version of the history of life on Earth, where the very top is the beginning of the day, 12 o'clock midnight, the bottom is 12 noon, about 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. on either of the sides. At the point when the conditions on Earth were adequate for supporting life, we start to see the origin of prokaryotes. The first fossil evidence of this is around 4 billion years ago. There is some more indirect evidence of the presence of life earlier than that, but our first definite knowledge of life on Earth dates back about 4 billion years. And the next major event in the history of life is among these prokaryotes, among these bacteria, we have groups beginning to do this process called photosynthesis. So this happened in our 24-hour clock a little bit before 6 a.m. And what happens with photosynthesis is the production of oxygen and the taking up of carbon dioxide. So if you'll remember, we have this second atmosphere that we talked about after the majority of the hydrogen and helium gas escaped from the atmosphere. We start to have this atmosphere that's dominated by these volcanic gases, carbon dioxide, ammonia, methane, and water vapor. As these photosynthetic bacteria start to produce oxygen, it's going to accumulate over very, very long periods of time. But gradually over that long period of time, we transition from this primarily volcanic atmosphere to this more oxygen-rich atmosphere. So it did take a very long time for oxygen to start accumulating because basically oxygen, molecular oxygen gas is highly, highly reactive. The first thing that started happening is this oxygen started oxidizing other substances. So we had a lot of, for example, oxidation of iron, basically rusting, that was taking up all of this oxygen and incorporating it into other substances and sequestering it in the earth. And so it's really right around between 2 and 2.5 billion years ago that we start to get levels of oxygen that somewhat resemble the current atmosphere. We start to get this accumulation, this increase in atmospheric oxygen levels around 12 noon. So the next major innovation in the history of life is the origin of eukaryotes. So eukaryotes are associated with some very, very important evolutionary innovations, including the invention of sexual reproduction. So not all eukaryotes do this, but only eukaryotes have sexual reproduction. Same thing with multicellularity. It was invented within eukaryotes, but not all eukaryotes are multicellular. So it's something that not all eukaryotes have, but only eukaryotes are multicellular. And as we've seen several times, this eukaryote lineage is characterized by having undergone these endosymbiotic events in which they take in smaller prokaryotic organisms that do not get digested and perform some sort of function for that eukaryotic cell. So this is the origin of mitochondria. So here we see this first ancestral eukaryotic cell. We see the beginnings of this endomembrane system, this compartmentalization of different structures within the cell, and the engulfing of an aerobic bacterium that is going to undergo aerobic metabolism, producing a large amount of ATP, which is a benefit for this eukaryotic cell. The eukaryotic cell provides a protected environment. They become permanently associated to the point where they're no longer separate species. So the key evidence supporting this endosymbiotic origin of mitochondria and plastids includes inner membranes of both organelles are similar to the plasma membranes that we see in living bacteria. The DNA structure and the division of these organelles are similar to cell division, binary fission in bacteria. Both organelles transcribe and translate their own individual DNA separate from the nuclear DNA in that eukaryotic cell. And the ribosomes that are found in these mitochondria and plastids, including chloroplasts, are more similar to bacterial ribosomes than they are to eukaryotic ribosomes. So we do have a lot of good indications that this is in fact the correct origin for mitochondria and plastids. After the origin of eukaryotes, there was a second endosymbiotic event that occurred within one particular group of eukaryotes, the lineage leading to red algae, green algae, and plants, that gave rise to chloroplasts. So here is our eukaryotic cell that already has mitochondria. Remember, this mitochondrion was taken in the common ancestor of all eukaryotes, so all eukaryotes have mitochondria. And then the second endosymbiotic event occurred, taking in a cyanobacterium that already undergoes photosynthesis, and this cell is now able to incorporate that photosynthetic function into its own cell function through this endosymbiotic relationship. The next major innovation that we see occurs somewhere around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Right here, this lighter blue line is the origin of multicellularity. So this is where we start to see multicellular life, the first evidence of multicellular fossils. So the very earliest multicellular fossil that is known cannot actually be accurately ascribed to any particular living group, but it occurred right here around 1.5 billion years ago. Multicellularity was really the evolutionary event that's most strongly associated with the major radiation of animals. So if we think about oxygen levels through the history of the Earth, what we see is the origin of photosynthesis here around 3.5 billion years ago. But remember, there's this long period of time before the oxygen actually started accumulating in the atmosphere because of this high reactivity, formation of iron oxides in the Earth. We don't start to see real accumulations of oxygen until between 2 and 2.5 billion years ago. But once we do, this is where we start to see the earliest evidence of multicellular organisms. And so this image that you're seeing here is a recreation of that earliest multicellular fossil that we find in the fossil record. We see a huge spike in oxygen levels. This would have been associated with a sharp decrease in carbon dioxide, leading to a glaciation. Remember, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. When its levels are reduced, the surface temperature of the Earth decreases, and this can lead to major glaciation events. So this heavy blue line here reflects a major glaciation event. So after this glaciation, we see a bit of a decrease in oxygen levels. And at around the time these oxygen levels stabilize, we start to see evidence of the first multicellular algae. And as a result of having this increase in photosynthetic organisms, particularly multicellular photosynthetic organisms, eventually we start to see again another dramatic increase in oxygen levels associated with a decrease in carbon dioxide, because remember, these photosynthetic organisms are also taking up carbon dioxide, leading to another global glaciation event. And as these oxygen levels increase, we end up getting all the way up to current oxygen levels. And associated with these increasing oxygen levels, here we see the earliest sponges at a little bit before 500 million years ago. And once we get up to current oxygen levels, this is when we start to see extreme diversification in the animal faunas in the ocean. So this is where the Cambrian Explosion happened, where there is this huge proliferation leading to the first fossil evidence of nearly all of the living phyla that exist today. Some of them appear before the Cambrian Explosion, but by the end of the Cambrian Explosion, we have representatives from all of the living phyla of animals. And this is strongly associated with these changes in oxygen levels in the Earth's atmosphere. So the next major evolutionary event that occurred was the transition to land. And so the first organisms to come to land were bacteria and other unicellular protists, followed eventually by plants. And so the earliest land plants are seen about 450 million years ago. This is the earliest fossil evidence of land plants. There is some genetic evidence that land plants diverged from their most recent common ancestor earlier than that, but we have the first fossil evidence of plants on land about 9:15 p.m. And there's also strong evidence that these first land plants co-colonized land in association with symbiotic fungi. Probably neither of them could have made this transition on their own. So let's take a look at what it takes to become a fossil. So what actually is a fossil? How does this evidence that we see for these events in the history of life come about? The example that I'm showing you here is an example of a hominid, but the same principles will apply to pretty much any fossil. We see this hominid coming and dying close to the water. Generally, the soft tissues are going to be either consumed or decomposed, leaving only the hard skeletal elements. So this can be bone, it can be an exoskeleton, any kind of hard parts. If these hard parts become associated with water and are covered over to prevent any further decomposition of the hard tissues, what happens is that this water with minerals dissolved in it starts to invade the spaces between the cells and deposit those minerals. And so as the cells disappear, the mineral replaces the living cells, and you basically have bones turn to stones, or whatever that hard tissue is, becoming mineralized and turning into stones. And so this again requires usually an anaerobic environment covered over with silt or sediment to prevent the decomposition of the organic material, and also a source of water with mineral dissolved in it so that the water can get into those spaces and deposit the minerals. So most organisms don't fossilize. The formation of a fossil is a very, very rare event in terms of all of the organisms that have ever lived on Earth. It's very hard to become a fossil. As the Earth changes and the areas are no longer covered with water, eventually these layers of sediment erode away and the fossil can become exposed. So, what are the organisms most likely to fossilize? Organisms that live in or near water, with hard parts that can be exposed to some kind of conditions that are going to cover over their body's remains and protect them from decomposition. So now let's think about how all of this organismal diversity comes about. How do we get these diversifications? And so there are two alternate models of how this happens. So the first is called gradualism, and this is the one that Darwin really preferred. This was his main idea about how evolution occurred, and this is the idea that if we think of this x-axis as being morphology, the y-axis being time, so we're starting here at an earlier time and going forward in time as we go up. As these lines kind of slant, these are changes in any aspect of morphology, so any kind of evolutionary change. And so this is the idea that as time goes on, change is occurring gradually and constantly. So this constant low level of change through time, and then every once in a while, things have changed enough compared to their closest relatives that we would consider this a speciation event. And these speciation events are going to happen every once in a while anywhere along these branches, as long as enough differences have accumulated through this very slow evolution. The other model that we have for how this happens is called punctuated equilibrium. So what we see in punctuated equilibrium are these short bursts of rapid change associated with bursts of speciation. So this can be associated with a sudden change in the habitat or any kind of change in the environment that's going to result in rapid evolutionary change, and as a result also rapid speciation. So we still have morphology on the x-axis. Any sort of horizontal movement is a change in morphology. Time on the y-axis going from longer ago to more recent. And what we say here are long periods of no evolutionary change, followed by this rapid burst of change. This horizontal line reflects a lot of change in a very, very short period of time. And according to the punctuated equilibrium model, this is the usual mode of evolution. Long periods of stasis or lack of evolutionary change, followed by these bursts of speciation and rapid change. So this idea of punctuated equilibrium is very much related to the macroevolutionary concept of adaptive radiation. In an adaptive radiation, one or a small group of species rapidly diversifies into a large number of descendant species. So this is characterized by a relatively short period of time with very, very short branch lengths, indicating the rapid speciation and rapid changes in morphological or ecological divergence in these short periods of time. So what are the different factors that can lead to an adaptive radiation? So again, an adaptive radiation is a rapid diversification in a lineage, large number of speciation events in a short period of time, by adapting to a wide range of different resource zones. So why do we get this rapid adaptation to a lot of different resource zones? Well, one reason this can happen is that there can be a key innovation, a new trait that arises by evolution that allows a species to use resources or other aspects of the environment that were previously inaccessible to it. So some kind of new evolutionary innovation that opens up a large range of possibilities for different ways to use the environment. One example of a key innovation is multicellularity. So once you have different body parts, different individual cells, these cells can be specialized for different functions. You can have increases in complexity that opens up a large range of possibilities in different ways that you can use your environment. The fauna that you're seeing here is a fossil assemblage that is found earlier than the Cambrian Explosion, called the Ediacaran fauna. Some of these, it's not clear whether they're more closely related to plants, more closely related to animals. There are some that are clearly similar to living phyla, such as these jellyfish, but this is a whole fossil assemblage that arose very soon after the origin of multicellularity. The other way one of these adaptive radiations can occur is ecological opportunity. So invasion of a new habitat where there are lots of different ecological resources available. It can also be associated with a mass extinction event, leaving many empty niches that can be invaded by a small group of species. So the Cambrian Explosion is a classic example of an adaptive radiation. This occurred after the extinction of the Ediacaran fauna. So again, a key innovation would have been multicellularity, differentiation of cells, differentiation of tissues that led to greater resource use, but also it's associated with this ecological opportunity provided by the extinction of the Ediacaran fauna. There are lots of different kinds of resources that were being exploited by the Ediacaran fauna that are now available for use by this later radiation of animals. So this Cambrian explosion occurred around 500 million years ago, and again, this is the origin of most of the major phyla, which are associated with the basic body plans that we find in animals. So all living animal phyla appear in Cambrian fossil deposits. Some of them have their origin earlier than the Cambrian, but by the end of the Cambrian, we have seen all of the animal phyla. If we think about overall macroevolutionary patterns of diversity, so diversity in a lineage is going to depend on the relative rates of speciation and extinction. If you're generating more species than you're losing, then you're going to have a lot of diversity. If you're losing more species than are being generated, you're going to have a decrease in diversity. So we've seen many of the factors that contribute to rates of speciation back in the speciation chapter, and we've also talked about these adaptive radiations that are going to lead to high rates of speciation. So now let's think about the risk factors for extinction. Having a small population size is a big risk factor for extinction. A small population size makes populations susceptible to genetic drift, maladaptive evolution, and other sort of accidental loss of a population. Having a limited geographic range is a high risk factor for extinction. Having low genetic variability means that you're less able to adapt to changes in your environment. It's a definite risk factor for extinction. And then also, sudden changes in the environment that are happening too fast for this relatively slow process of evolution to adapt to can also lead to extinctions. So now let's summarize. The major events in the history of life were the origin of photosynthesis, the origin of eukaryotes, the origin of multicellularity, and also the colonization of land by the different groups. There are two major models for the tempo and mode of evolution. Gradualism, in which species change gradually and constantly, and then occasionally become different enough to be considered a separate species. And punctuated equilibrium, in which bursts of speciation are coordinated with very rapid evolutionary change, followed by very long periods of stasis or lack of evolutionary change. So punctuated refers to this rapid burst of speciation, this rapid change. Equilibrium refers to these long periods of stasis. Equilibrium, lack of change. Organismal diversity depends on the relative rates of speciation and extinction. Adaptive radiation is a rapid burst of speciation in response to a key innovation or a new ecological opportunity. High rates of extinction are associated with rapidly changing environments, low genetic diversity, limited geographic range, and small population size.